Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the African Five-A-Side podcast. Today is the final episode of Matchday 1. Throughout Matchday 1, we've been looking at African heads of state and their relationship with football. And today is the final match day. So today is the day we're going to be profiling our final head of state, and we're going to have our five-a-side team. And the next match day 2, will be a completely different topic. So thanks for sticking around. If you haven't seen the earlier episodes, please go check them out. And once again, this podcast and everything on this channel is brought to you by the good folks over at www.africasacountry.com. If you haven't checked that out yet, please do, because we have some really, really great content coming out ahead of the African Cup of Nations. We will be in the Ivory Coast for the African Cup of Nations. And I really think that the kind of coverage that you're going to get there is unique. You're not going to find it anywhere else. So, without further ado, let's introduce the final member of our five-a-side squad for match day 1, and that is Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda. So before we begin, let's do a quick bio of Kenneth Kaunda. I mean, his father is a reverend, his mother is a teacher. Actually, it says online that she was the first African woman to teach in colonial Northern Rhodesia. And for those that don't know, Northern Rhodesia is the colonial name for Zambia. So that's quite a distinction. And you can see throughout his life that religion and football are very, very important to Kenneth Kaunda. He talks about, getting a good education at home, following his parents' footsteps, and he also becomes a teacher, reading the likes of Mahatma Gandhi and being influenced by it, the words really going straight into his heart. And then he bounces around Africa and Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and he also teaches around the continent. In 1949, he gets a little politically active. He's one of the founding members of the Zambian chapter, of the ANC. Everybody knows the ANC from South Africa as really the leading faction that fought against apartheid. But they also had a branch in Zambia. He's imprisoned in 1955 for his political activities. And then he switches political parties to the United National Independence Party, the UNIP. And he rises the ranks there, and he wins an election and becomes the first president of the Zambian Republic in 1964. So that's a very brief bio of Kenneth Kaunda. And now that we've got that out of the way, let's check out how football was influential for him, how he loved football, and how he instituted different reforms to try and spur on the development of football in Zambia. So what you have to know about Zambia is that football was extremely popular, really from independence, but even prior to independence. And this isn't something that we've talked about throughout Matchday 1, because we've been focusing on African football history from about 1957 and the creation of the Confederation of African Football in CAF, with Gamal Abdel Nasser. But football was brought to the continent via blue-collar Europeans who were brought to Africa to build infrastructure for the European colonies. So we're talking about, people that work on laying down train tracks, people that work in the shipping docks, really like that kind of blue-collar manual labor. They're the ones that brought football to the African continent, and they were mostly playing within themselves. But then you also had missionary schools and, some of the institutions, the civilizing institutions, bring sport and football as a sort of way that they believe that they could instill good values in the local indigenous population, which is extremely paternalistic and insulting kind of, but that was one of the reasons why sport was also brought into the African continent. I mean, when I say sport, I mean, the football, for example. And so they even had a name for this doctrine called muscular Christianity, and Dr. Peter Alegi from Michigan State University talks about this in his book, African Soccerscapes. And we know that Kenneth Kaunda's parents, were religious and involved in the Christian faith, and that's probably where he encountered football for the first time, actually in those missionaries, in those schools. And what I'm going to say here is important, because unlike Gamal Abdel Nasser, unlike President Mobutu of Congo and Zaire, Um, we think, and scholars think, that Kenneth Kaunda actually loved football. You know, the others, we said we weren't really sure if they loved football. They mostly instrumentalized it and used it for political means and diplomatic influence. But for example, the author and sports scholar David Goldblatt argues that Kenneth Kaunda was a rarity, and I'm quoting, Kenneth Kaunda was a rarity, an African president who not only backed football, but also actually liked it. Um, so for some of the arguments that he makes is, for example, President Mobutu, after the humiliation of the 1974 World Cup, never went to the stadium again. You know, um, even Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who we also spoke about, who's also in our team, once he was exiled and moved to Guinea, never again did he write or speak about football in his memoirs or his letters. So it leads to really credible evidence that maybe they didn't really love football, but they knew how to use it. But that's not the case with Kenneth Kaunda. Immediately after Zambia gets its independence in '64 and Kaunda is president, you start seeing policies that capitalize on that enthusiasm for football. And so you have former British players such as Phil Woosnam, Fred Goodwin. They're coming to Zambia to conduct coaching courses. You have players who end up being like player coaches. Jackie Sewell was with City of Lusaka FC, Tony Costello with Roan United FC, Ian Greaves with Rokana United FC, and you had these clubs creating links, playing matches, friendlies against the likes of Leicester City, Wolverhampton Wanderers, Newcastle United, Cardiff City, and so on and so forth. Actually, the fact that Zambia were doing this in the 60s, that's quite rare on the African continent. Ghana had some experience playing a lot of European nations in the 50s and 60s, but nothing like this. And it really led to very early success in this country's history. The other important reform that Kenneth Kaunda did was he, like Ahmed Sekou Toure, focused on mass education. At the time of independence, Zambia only had 100 university graduates. I believe it was around 5,000 or 6,000 Zambians had been to secondary school for more than a year or two. So there was a real lack of formal education that they really needed to address. So schools are being built, and school teams are also being built. And players like Moses Simwala and Akim Musenge, who later played in the national team, they were quite influenced, and they really came through these school teams. And these school teams also went on European tours and played all over northwestern Europe mostly. And so when you listen to Zambians speak, they'll say that the 1970 team, that was the most impressive team. That was the best team in Zambian football history, despite the fact that they never won any silverware. But you had, for example, one of the best players of that generation, one of the best players in African football history is Godfrey Chitalu. Godfrey Chitalu is known for having the most ridiculous goal-scoring record in football. If you remember that crazy season where Lionel Messi, I want to say that he scored 80 or 90 goals in a calendar year, and everybody was saying that that's the record. Godfrey Chitalu scored more than 100 goals in a year, and it's all documented. That's a record. I know Lionel Messi's doing it at Barcelona, but Godfrey Chitalu was doing it in the local league, and everything is recorded, and it's still a hell of a feat. Others like Bernard Chanda were also good. You had a really great generation. And they get to the 1974 AFCON final, and they lose to Zaire, Mobutu's Zaire. And we speak about that in an episode of Matchday 1. If you want to go back to the Mobutu episode, we talk about that AFCON in some detail. So President Kaunda, or at this time, he gets in the habit of showing up to the stadium. And unlike, Sekou Toure from Guinea, who's in our five-a-side team, would come around at halftime waving his handkerchief in a convertible car, driving around the track. Mobutu would show up as well. These presidents usually, except for Gamal Abdel Nasser, the rest of them, they would show up and they would shake hands with players and sometimes make speeches at matches. Kenneth Kaunda would actually go onto the pitch, juggle, bounce the ball on his head a few times. And it shows again, he's reading Gandhi. He's more affable. He's more personable. He has this doctrine of African and Zambian humanism. which is based on three tenets: mutual aid, trust, and loyalty to the community. And for him, football is a manifestation of all of that. If you have players or people practicing football on a mass level, it's so that they can build on those three tenets and be a credit to their society. And so I say all of this so you can get an idea of him and his personality. Kenneth Kaunda was not somebody that was unlike Mobutu or Sekou Toure, who were, like, I'm not saying he wasn't a little authoritarian, but they were accused of being murderous, incredibly. Kenneth Kaunda is not on that. It's not like that, really. So he got somebody that's a little more playful, somebody that cares more about religion, probably more God-fearing, and he loves football. So in his own words, after the AFCON, before sending them off to the AFCON in Egypt, an AFCON that, by the way, Muhammad Ali attends, prior to his fight, the Rumble in the Jungle, he says, in his own words, sport was a universal recreation which helped develop a sound mind and a sound body. Apart from acting as a catalyst to character building, football provides fertile soil in which to plant the important seed of comradeship at all levels. And so you see, again, sport for him leads to humanism, Zambian humanism, and that for him creates a healthy society. So that's one of the reasons why he can justify loving sport so much. But the real reason why I've included Kenneth Kaunda in this Matchday, he's not like the biggest name. Maybe he's not as famous as Nkrumah or Gamal Abdel Nasser. His side wasn't as successful, but he institutes a model here that I think is very fascinating and I think is still relevant to this day. In the 1980s, Kaunda pushes national enterprises, conglomerates like the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, the ZCCM, to invest huge sums in football development. And what you have is basically companies, even companies like BP or Shell, who are there usually to exploit the mines in the copper belt and in the north of Zambia. And what they have to do, it's not that they have to, but they want to suck up to Kaunda a little bit, and they want to show that they're investing in the society. What they end up doing is they end up basically sponsoring a lot of football, and they even end up partnering up with teams. And this happens as well in a few different countries across the African continent. So we're going to talk about it as a model. Also, you have, your sporting associations. These will typically be, non-profit associations that can get subsidies, from like a Ministry of Youth and Sport. Usually they have a board, and members can be able to, they'll be able to vote for the president and the board, and so on and so forth. And I mean, a good example of this will be like, for example, Espérance de Tunis. Maybe they're not getting subsidies, but they're an association, and each member of the club can have the right to vote for, the president and the vice president of the club, and so on and so forth. Then you have something called, you have like LLCs pretty much, like Société Sportive par Action, basically where shareholders can buy shares in a club. And that's really much like the Premier League model now. And that's what we have in places like Algeria, for example, where, private businessmen can technically buy shares and, on the Algeria Stock Exchange. And you're really reliant on the wealth of your shareholders to really bankroll and fund you. But you have another model, and this is a model that's really taking place in a lot of socialist republics like Algeria in the 1970s or Zambia in the 1980s. And that's where you have national enterprises, things like, the Zambian Consolidated Copper Mines. In Algeria, for example, Sonatrach, the biggest hydrocarbon company in Africa, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. They come together and they'll sort of become like a partner with the club. So, for example, Sonatrach owns MC of Algiers, and you have, like clubs like Nkana Red Devils, Power Dynamos. These are all, enterprises that have partnered up with football clubs. Why is that important? Like, especially in the heydays of the social, of these, excuse me. Why is that important? In the heydays of these like socialist republics, what you had was players ended up being employees. So, for example, talk about GS Kabylie in Algeria, who won 2 Champions League titles in 1981 and 1990. When I spoke to the players then, they told me like, we would go to work in the morning in a factory for like 3 4 hours, and then in the afternoon we would go train. And they didn't mind it so much because when the playing career was over, they were trained in something. They had a job waiting for them, and even the salaries were like completely set on seniority and how long you worked there and everything. It had nothing to do with your skill on the pitch or the personality that you had. And so as a result, the clubs were better structured. They were safer and more secure economically. Um, although they were not professional in the sense of the word as we see it nowadays, like in the Premier League, and they were not really money-making machines as clubs can be nowadays. And so these parastatal conglomerates, that's why I kind of wanted to throw Kenneth Kaunda in there, and I wanted to talk about it as a model and explore it as a model. Is there a future for it? I actually believe there is. Again, I'm going to talk about Algeria because I know it best. Algeria in 2000 and I believe 9 or 11 wanted to move away from clubs being sporting associations, and they wanted to move them to being private companies. It didn't really work. It's because African football and football in Africa is not necessarily a profit-driven activity. Businessmen are not going to go invest their money in a club where they're going to get insulted if they don't win the league, and they're just going to keep bleeding money time and time and time again. Some will because, especially the biggest clubs, that gives you a lot of credit and a lot of clout. But many are going to say, what's the point? Why am I doing this? And so what's happening now in Algeria 10 years on is that no businessmen invested in the clubs, except for one or two, and then they've been indicted for corruption. And supporters are now asking the state to actually bring a national enterprise so that they can have some security. And this happened with USM of Algiers. MC of Algiers was already like this for more than 10 years now. It happened with GS Kabylie. It happened with ES Sétif. It's happened with all clubs in Algeria practically, where supporters are asking the state to find a national enterprise that can bankroll their club. Players are obviously no longer going to be employees of these national enterprises or these state-owned companies. But what you will find is that the states will now all of a sudden have a lot of influence over the club that they're sponsoring. And that's something to keep an eye on. That's something that's very interesting. Anyways, that kind of financial structure and stability brought about another great period in Zambian football history, really, from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s. And obviously, around that time, the team is known actually as the KK11, Kenneth Kaunda 11. How many presidents can say that they named their team after themselves? Actually, in Matchday 1, maybe we could say that the DR Congo Leopards are named after technically Mobutu and his Abacost, and we could say that maybe the Sili National from Guinea are also named after the PDG in Guinea. So another reason why you should go listen to those episodes on Matchday 1. But he was so omnipresent. The players really played for him. He would be in a stadium all the time, and he was really known as like the number one supporter of the national team. And they had a great 1988 Olympic Games. They were finished first in the group. They beat Italy, but they were dumped out in the knockout stages to West Germany and Jürgen Klinsmann. Kalusha Bwalia emerged as, until this day, I think the best Zambian player of all time. He scored a hat-trick in those Olympic Games, I believe, against Italy. In 1993, there's that horrible air disaster where most of the first team actually perishes off the coast of Gabon. And just a year later, with a bunch of youngsters and players that hadn't been too capped before, Kalusha Bwalia leads Zambia to the 1994 AFCON final. You know how hard that is to do in Tunisia, and they just lose to Nigeria. That golden age of Nigeria, by the way, your JJ Kosha, Sunday Olise, Rashidi Yakini, etc. In 96 AFCON, they finished third place as well. So Kenneth Kaunda by then is gone, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and all these countries across the African continent are doing away with, one-party rule, and they're opening up to the, democratic movements. Kaunda does the same, and as a result, he's voted out in the early 90s. But it's not really the kind of, he's not voted out and exiled and everything. He still remains, somebody that's involved in Zambian political life and somebody that could affect positive change in his country in other ways. And so that's really the reason why I wanted to include Kenneth Kaunda in the African five-a-side matchday. Sorry, in the African five-a-side team for Matchday 1. It's because of his vision and different ways that he thought he could affect change in African football, especially through the idea of having parastatal conglomerates and these national enterprises invest in football. And that's it. I can't believe we're finished season one. It's not season one, it's Matchday 1 of the African Five-A-Side podcast. To recap, we have Gamal Abdel Nasser in goal. We have President Mobutu in attack. We have Kwame Nkrumah. We have Ahmed Sekou Toure. And we have Kenneth Kaunda in defense. We're going to play a 1-3-1. That's going to be our formation. So I really hope you all enjoyed and appreciated Matchday 1 of the African Five-A-Side podcast. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, please go do that, and I think you'll enjoy it. And as you can see or maybe hear, we're making some changes. This podcast is going to start incrementally getting a little bit better, and it's going to be produced with higher quality, both on the audio and visual side of it. And yeah, just keep it locked, keep it posted, because we're going to start match day soon, as early as next week. And yeah, AFCON coverage is really going to start ramping up. So thanks for listening. Really appreciate all of you. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a 5-star review. Leave a comment. It's always appreciated, and I try to respond to everybody. And thank you, and we'll speak to you in a few days for the African Football Roundup. Peace.